The late afternoon sun, already beginning its slow descent, cast long, somber shadows that stretched like mournful fingers across the engraved names at the Serenity Park Veterans Memorial. It was a meticulously kept sanctuary of granite and bronze, a pocket of solemnity tucked away from the bustling main thoroughfare of Oak Haven. A gentle, almost reverent breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oaks, standing sentinel around its perimeter, their gnarled branches seeming to offer a silent, protective embrace. This was a place of quiet reflection, of profound remembrance, a tangible testament to sacrifices most could only imagine. For Marcus Thorne, it was also a place inextricably linked to his sister Clara and the memory of her husband David, a memory that felt as raw today as it had 5 years ago. Then the world, or at least this small sacred corner of it, tore itself violently apart. A deafening roar, visceral and concussive, ripped through the tranquil air, a sound that punched the breath from his lungs. It was followed instantaneously by a shockwave that slammed into Marcus with the brutal force of a physical blow, throwing him from the polished granite bench where he'd been lost in thought, his mind replaying a cherished memory of David's infectious laugh. Debris, sharp chunks of stone clods of earth, and shattered bronze plaque fragments rained down with punishing force. The acrid, unmistakable smell of high explosives, sharp and sickeningly familiar, instantly filled his lungs, a scent he knew too well from too many grim briefings, too many disaster sites across the nation and the globe. Smoke, thick, gray, and choking, billowed upwards, obscuring the heart of the memorial, the very spot where the flag usually flew. The shouts of surprised confusion, and then horrifyingly of pain, were just beginning to register over the persistent, high-pitched ringing in his ears. Marcus, Chief of Federal Public Safety for the entire nation, a title that felt utterly irrelevant in this moment of raw personal assault, reacted on instinct honed by years, by decades of crisis management. He was on his feet in a heartbeat, ignoring the searing sharp pain that lanced through his left shoulder, where something heavy had struck him. His eyes, narrowed and intensely focused, were already scanning, assessing, cataloging the devastation. The central flagpole, moments before flying the stars and stripes at a respectful half-mast, was now a grotesque, twisted caricature of itself, the flag itself, torn, smoldering, and partially buried in the churned earth. A significant, gaping portion of the main dedication wall, the one bearing the meticulously engraved names of local heroes lost in distant, brutal wars, David's name among them, was now a jagged, smoking crater. The carefully tended flower beds, vibrant with late summer blooms, that Clara herself often helped maintain, were obliterated, erased. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, calculated attack. This was a desecration. A woman's shrill, almost triumphant voice cut through the rising chaos, a sound so incongruous it felt like a second assault. Finally, some peace and quiet around here for a change. Serves them right with their endless disrespectful racket. Marcus turned his head, snapping towards the sound, his gaze locking onto a figure emerging with an air of nonchalant agitation from behind a manicured, perfectly sculpted hedge that separated the park from the pristine, almost aggressively perfect lawns of the adjacent Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association. She was middle-aged, impeccably dressed, in expensive athletic wear that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment, her face flushed with a strange, unsettlingly triumphant agitation. In one hand, she clutched what looked chillingly like a small, sophisticated remote detonator, Brenda Hoskins. He recognized her vaguely, her face a composite of features from contentious HOA meeting reports he'd inadvertently overheard discussed, or rather lamented, during his infrequent visits to Clara. Clara, who lived much to his current incandescent and rapidly solidifying fury within that very association. He started towards her, his mind a maelstrom of cold professional outrage and an even colder, icier calculation. Several elderly veterans, men who had been gathered for their quiet, informal weekly remembrance service, were struggling dazed and disoriented to their feet amidst the debris. One man old enough to have fought in Korea clutched his chest, his face a ghastly shade of pale. Another, younger but still bearing the weight of years in service, was bleeding freely from a jagged cut on his forehead. The sheer, unadulterated audacity, the callous, breathtaking inhumanity of the woman's statement in the face of such palpable devastation and injury was almost beyond comprehension. She had absolutely no idea who he was, of course. She had no conceivable concept of the righteous storm she had, just with such casual malice unleashed. His sister Clara had chosen to live in Oakhaven Estates precisely because, with a cruel and bitter irony, she'd sought peace and quiet after her husband David, a decorated combat medic whose heroism had saved countless lives, had returned from his final tour with wounds both horrifyingly visible and devastatingly unseen. Those unseen wounds, the relentless siege of PTSD, had eventually tragically claimed him far from any battlefield. This memorial, this very ground now violated, was sacred to Clara. It was, in many ways, David's true spiritual resting place, a place where she found a fragile, fleeting solace. And by extension, it was sacred to Marcus. He'd been here today unannounced for a rare, quiet moment of personal reflection, a brief respite before a formal dedication ceremony for a new wing for disabled veterans at the local VA hospital later in the week, an event at which he was with a grim new sense of foreboding, scheduled to deliver the keynote address. "Ma'am." Marcus began, his voice dangerously low, a quiet rumble that belied the inferno of rage building within him. "Are you admitting to causing this explosion, to this destruction?" Brenda Hoskins, for that was indeed her name, tossed her perfectly highlighted blonde hair with an air of profound irritation. "Of course I am. It's about time someone had the courage to do something. The constant noise from this place." She gestured dismissively at the smoking ruin. "The endless ceremonies, the infernal motorcycles for their ridiculous little parades, the 21 gun salutes at all hours of the day and night. It's a disgrace, an absolute blight on our community. I have a right to the peaceful enjoyment of my property. I've lodged dozens of complaints with the HOA, with the city, dozens, and been utterly ignored." She brandished the detonator as if it were an unpaid parking ticket. She was righteously and victoriously contesting. The sheer, staggering disconnect between her trivial, self-absorbed grievances and the horrifying violence she had just unleashed was almost paralyzing. "Noise complaints." Marcus echoed the words, feeling utterly absurd, alien on his tongue, as his gaze swept again over the injured men, the desecrated wall of names, the smoldering flag. "You used military-grade explosives for noise complaints, sirens." A welcome sound for once were already wailing in the near distance, growing closer with reassuring speed. Oakhaven was generally a sleepy, affluent town, but its relative proximity to several key federal installations meant that its emergency response capabilities were thankfully usually swift and efficient. Good, very good. They were just exceptionally powerful fireworks. Brenda Hoskins said dismissively, though the mangled steel and fractured granite starkly belied her casual, almost flippant description. "A wake-up call, if you will, to make a point. They simply wouldn't listen to reason to polite requests." She seemed genuinely, delusionally to believe her own ludicrous justification, her eyes shining with a fervent, self-righteous light. Marcus took another deliberate step closer, his federal agent instincts honed over countless high-stakes operations, kicking in, overriding the searing personal rage, channeling it into cold, focused action. His mind was already cataloging the necessary steps to secure the immediate scene, ensure medical aid for all injured parties, apprehend the perpetrator. Without further incident, positively identify the device used, assess for any secondary threats or devices. "You need to give me that detonator, ma'am." He stated, his voice devoid of inflection, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "And you need to understand very clearly that you are in an exceptionally serious situation, far more serious than you can possibly comprehend." Brenda Hoskins scoffed a sound of pure, unadulterated disdain. "Oh, please, don't be so overly dramatic. It's just a bit of property damage easily repaired. They can rebuild it. Maybe this time they'll have the common decency to build it somewhere less intrusive. And you—" She looked him up and down, taking in his civilian attire, the dust and grime now covering him. "Have absolutely no authority here anyway. This is strictly an HOA matter internal to Oakhaven Estates." She gestured vaguely possessively towards the invisible boundary line of her pristine, regulated domain. The first local police units were arriving now, tires screeching to a halt, officers spilling out of their cruisers, their faces initially set in expressions of routine response, then morphing into masks of shock and grim understanding as they took in the full scope of the scene. Marcus made immediate eye contact with the first officer on scene, a young, somewhat overwhelmed-looking patrolman, whose eyes widened perceptibly at the sight of the destruction, and then at Marcus himself, recognizing him from news reports. "Secure her." Marcus ordered, his voice carrying the unconscious, deeply ingrained weight of command that brooked no argument. "She's admitted to setting off the device. That's the detonator in her right hand. Be cautious." The officer, momentarily startled by Marcus's authoritative tone and unexpected presence, hesitated for only a split second before his training and the sheer gravity of the situation took over. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firming, "please put that device slowly on the ground and then place your hands behind your back." Brenda Hoskins' face contorted with theatrical indignation. "How dare you? I am a homeowner. I have rights. I am Brenda Hoskins, head of the Oak Haven Estates Beautification and Harmony Committee. You can't treat me like some common criminal." As the officer moved with practiced efficiency to apprehend her, Brenda, surprisingly agile for her build and age, tried to dart away. Not towards the street and potential escape, but oddly, almost irrationally deeper into the memorial park, towards the still-smoking crater where the wall of names had stood. It was a strange, almost panicked move, a flicker of something other than righteous indignation in her eyes. Before she could get more than a few feet a second, more seasoned officer intercepted her, his movements economical and decisive. The detonator clattered harmlessly to the grass as she was expertly handcuffed, her shrill, piercing protests about HOA regulations, personal property rights, and unwarranted harassment filling the otherwise stunned silence. Marcus watched her being subdued, his expression unreadable, his mind racing. "Fireworks," she'd said. The way the thick, reinforced granite had fractured the sheer concussive force he'd personally felt from 30 yards away. That wasn't any firework he was familiar with, not even remotely. His gut and internal barometer, rarely wrong, told him this was far from over. This was in all likelihood just the horrifying beginning. The local police chief, a man named Bill Henderson, whom Marcus had met briefly at a regional security conference some years prior, was now on scene, his usually florid face ashen as he surveyed the carnage. Marcus Thorne. "What in God's name?" Henderson began, his voice strained, then stopped short as his professional gaze swept the area, his mind clearly struggling to process the enormity of it. "Chief Henderson." Marcus acknowledged with a curt nod, his own shock now encased in a layer of professional steel. "This woman, Brenda Hoskins, a resident of your esteemed Oak Haven Estates, has claimed responsibility. She states it was due to noise complaints." He let the sheer, unmitigated absurdity of that statement hang heavy in the acrid air for a long moment. "My primary concern right now, beyond her immediate custody, is the injured, and then securing this entire area as a federal crime scene. We need a full sweep by a highly qualified bomb squad. What she used was not a firecracker, Bill, not by a long shot." Henderson nodded already, barking concise orders into his radio, his initial shock giving way to practiced command. "I saw you were scheduled to be in town, Marcus. Didn't realize you'd be here. Are you okay?" He asked, his eyes briefly flicking to the torn fabric on Marcus's shoulder. "I'm fine." Marcus lied, the throbbing in his shoulder intensifying into a dull, insistent ache. "The veterans who were here are not. This memorial is not." His eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, drifted again to the desecrated wall of names, to the space where David's name had been. This was a deliberate act of domestic terrorism, Henderson, whatever her stated ludicrous motive. Treat it as such until proven otherwise, and get the FBI notified immediately. This has their name written all over it. The word terrorism hung heavy and almost physical weight in the smoke-filled air. Brenda Hoskins, still screeching with undiminished fervor about her property, values her HOA bylaws and the incompetence of local law enforcement, as she was placed none too gently into the back of a squad car, seemed more like a caricature of weaponized suburban entitlement than a hardened terrorist. But the act itself, the act was pure, unadulterated terror, calculated and brutal. The carefully constructed framework of Marcus Thorne's life was one of immense, often crushing responsibility. It was a constant, precarious balancing act between the vast, impersonal machinery of national security and the infrequent, intensely precious moments of personal connection. His sprawling Washington, D.C. office, nestled deep within a secure federal complex, was a sterile environment of encrypted communications, classified intelligence briefings, and strategic threat assessments, a world, a universe away from the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Haven, where his beloved sister Clara had chosen to painstakingly rebuild her life after unimaginable tragedy. Clara was his anchor, his most cherished human connection, his constant, poignant reminder of the profound human cost behind the abstract threats and geopolitical games he dealt with on a daily basis. Her husband, David Miller, a man Marcus had admired with a respect bordering on reverence, had come home from his final combat tour, a decorated hero but irrevocably broken. The invisible wounds, the relentless, insidious siege of post-traumatic stress had ultimately claimed him a casualty of war long after he'd left the battlefield. The Serenity Park Veterans Memorial wasn't just a local landmark, a collection of names etched in cold stone to Clara. It was David's spiritual final resting place, a tranquil space where she found a fragile, desperately needed solace. Marcus often felt the profound weight of David's absence, a silent, unspoken promise to protect the values, the freedoms David had fought and ultimately died for. This made the savage attack on the memorial not just a professional outrage, a statistic in a rising tide of domestic extremism, but a profound, deeply offensive personal violation. It felt like an attack on David himself, on Clara's fragile peace. His days were usually a relentless, overwhelming barrage of information, cryptic intelligence reports from shadowy global hotspots, complex threat assessments involving domestic extremist factions, high-stakes policy meetings with cabinet secretaries, and the ever-present sword of Damocles-like possibility of a national crisis demanding his immediate, unwavering, and often solitary attention. He was a man accustomed to thinking on a grand, almost unimaginable scale, to anticipating threats that most ordinary citizens never even conceived of. Yet here he was, in his civilian clothes, on an unscheduled, deeply personal visit, thrust into the very epicenter of a local incident that felt more offensively personal, more violating than many of the national crises he'd managed. The bitter irony was not lost on him. The chief of federal public safety for the United States, caught completely off guard, a victim himself, of a seemingly mundane suburban dispute that had inexplicably, monstrously escalated to the use of high explosives. Brenda Hoskins, on the other hand, was a prominent, if widely disliked figure within the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association. Not the president, that was a rotating, largely ceremonial role, but the self-appointed, undisputed queen of curb, appealed the fiercely territorial chair of the Beautification and Harmony Committee, a committee she had founded and populated largely with her own acolytes. Her reign within the HOA was characterized by the meticulous, almost fanatical enforcement of arbitrary and often nonsensical rules, a constant, unending stream of passive-aggressive notices about unapproved lawn ornaments, insufficiently edged walkways, non-regulation paint colors, and most notoriously, the precise mandated angle of decorative garden gnomes. To many residents of Oak Haven Estates, she was a persistent, inescapable annoyance, a petty tyrant in expensive, brightly colored tracksuits, a source of endless, exasperated sighs and eye rolls at community gatherings. Her vociferous, oft-repeated complaints about the adjacent Serenity Park Veterans Memorial, the occasional mournful sound of a lone bugle playing taps at sunset, the distant, respectful rumble of motorcycles during the annual Memorial Day parade, the dignified but, in her warped view, depressing and property value diminishing presence of disabled veterans attending remembrance ceremonies, were well known within the community and largely dismissed by most sensible people as the unhinged ramblings of an overly entitled, chronically dissatisfied crank. No one, however, not even her most fervent detractors within the HOA, could have predicted this. No one could have possibly fathomed the true depth of the darkness, the simmering, narcissistic rage festering beneath the meticulously manicured facade of her prize-winning, committee-approved petunias. One resident, a retired history professor named Dr. Alastair Finch, had once wryly commented at an HOA meeting that Brenda's obsession with order was less about aesthetics and more about a profound discomfort with anything that doesn't conform to her extremely narrow worldview, especially things that remind her of sacrifice or imperfection. His comment had earned him a month of relentless scrutiny over the height of his hedges. The inciting incident, the brutal detonation itself, was the catastrophic, horrifying manifestation of that festering, unchecked darkness. Brenda Hoskins, fueled by a toxic cocktail of narcissistic conviction in her own absolute righteousness and an astonishing, almost sociopathic lack of empathy, had irrevocably crossed a line from petty neighborhood tyranny to violent, terroristic extremism. Her repeatedly stated claim of noise complaints was becoming increasingly clear to Marcus, the flimsy, almost laughable pretext for an act of profound, calculated desecration and violence. She clearly saw the veterans, their memorial, their traditions not as symbols of sacrifice, honor, and remembrance, but as mere irritants, as unsightly blemishes on her perfect, orderly, suburban landscape, as intolerable obstacles to her absolute personal comfort and her vision of Oak Haven perfection. The immediate aftermath was a controlled yet palpably urgent blur of coordinated activity. Paramedics, their faces grim, tended to the injured veterans. Thankfully, initial assessments indicated none of the injuries were immediately life-threatening, though scrapes, deep bruises, potential concussions, and the profound shock of the blast were evident amongst all who had been near the epicenter. The most serious appeared to be Mr. Alistair Carmichael, a distinguished elderly gentleman, a veteran of 2 wars, who was exhibiting clear signs of cardiac distress. He was quickly stabilized and transported, lights flashing and sirens screaming, to Oak Haven General Hospital. Police officers, their numbers swelling rapidly efficiently, cordoned off a wide, ever-expanding perimeter. The FBI field office had been notified, and a special agent in charge was en route. The bomb squad, arriving with impressive, almost military speed from a nearby federal facility, a quiet direct call from Marcus to a secure unlisted line, had significantly expedited their dispatch, began a methodical, painstaking sweep of the entire park and its surroundings for secondary devices. Clara arrived. Then her face a mask of terror and disbelief, having heard the deafening explosion from her home just a few blocks away. She rushed towards Marcus, her eyes scanning him wildly for injury. "Marcus, oh my God, Marcus, are you David's, the memorial?" She stammered, her voice choked with unshed tears. He pulled her into a fierce hug, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm his professional composure. "I'm okay, Clara, I'm okay. Just a few bumps. But the memorial, it's bad." He held her for a moment longer, feeling her tremble. "The men who were here, some are injured, but it looks like they'll all pull through. They're strong, Clara, like David was." Chief Henderson approached them, his expression etched with a weary sort of resignation. "Marcus, we've got Hoskins downtown. She's something else, still ranting about her flower beds, but she's asking for a lawyer, a big gun from the city who usually handles messy divorces for the Oak Haven elite, not felony bombings." Marcus watched Brenda Hoskins being driven away, her enraged, distorted face briefly visible through the rear window of the departing police cruiser. Her shrill, unrepentant pronouncements about HOA rights, personal sanctity of property, and constant harassment echoed disturbingly in his mind. It was too easy, he thought, too neat. The Karen persona, the aggrieved homeowner, was almost too perfectly, too theatrically performed. And the device, he'd seen the initial damage assessment from the bomb squad leader. Even from a distance, the force required to shatter thick, reinforced granite and twist solid steel girders like licorice suggested something far more potent, far more professionally constructed than powerful fireworks. This wasn't the act of an amateur with a vendetta and a YouTube tutorial. This was something else entirely. The first stage of the rising action, the initial unfolding of the investigation, began almost immediately, and with a disturbing trajectory. At the local Oak Haven police station, Brenda Hoskins surprisingly was not contrite, not cowed, not even remotely intimidated by the gravity of her situation. Instead, she was belligerent, combative, demanding her lawyer, a notoriously slippery civil attorney named Wallace Thorne, no relation thankfully known, for representing wealthy Oak Haven residents in contentious property disputes and acrimonious divorces, not federal domestic terrorism cases. She reiterated her noise complaints ad nauseum, repeatedly painting herself as the long-suffering victim of a relentless campaign of harassment and auditory assault by the memorial and its attendees. She seemed utterly, unshakably convinced of her own righteousness, or Marcus suspected was playing the part with an unnerving, almost pathological conviction. Chief Henderson, a competent and dedicated local policeman, but someone clearly unaccustomed to dealing with crimes of this magnitude and perpetrators of this peculiar brand of delusion, found himself facing a suspect who was not only uncooperative, but also seemed to be operating under a completely different, almost alien understanding of reality. She keeps talking about aesthetic violations and covenant breaches. Marcus. Henderson reported later that evening, his voice laced with disbelief and exhaustion, when he met Marcus at the cordoned-off park, now illuminated by harsh mobile floodlights. Like she just pruned an unapproved rosebush, not blew up a national monument. Marcus, after giving his detailed initial statement to the arriving FBI agents and ensuring Clara, who, though deeply shaken, was now channeling her grief and anger into a fierce determination to see justice done, already coordinating with other veterans' families, was safe and somewhat calmed by the presence of supportive neighbors, made it unequivocally clear to Henderson and the FBI special agent in charge, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Special Agent Davies. Legally, Chief Henderson, your department initiated the arrest, and it's your jurisdiction for the immediate local charges. But the nature of this device, the deliberate targeting of a veterans memorial, the potential for broader conspiracy, this has profound federal implications. My office, the Department of Federal Public Safety, will be taking a keen, active, and overriding interest. My team will assist, or rather lead in any way you need, particularly with forensics on the explosive materials and any broader network. Davies nodded her firm agreement. This was now a joint federally led task force. The second shocking incident, a development that sent a fresh wave of unease through Marcus, unfolded over the next 24 hours. News of the Oak Haven Memorial bombing spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of national outrage. The image of the desecrated memorial, the poignant story of Brenda Hoskins's absurd, almost unbelievable justification, played on a continuous, infuriating loop on every news channel. But then a subtle, insidious counter-narrative began to emerge, slithering through the darker corners of the internet, seeded through anonymous accounts on fringe social media platforms and obscure hate-filled forums. Posts appeared almost simultaneously, defending Brenda Hoskins, bizarrely amplifying her noise complaints, suggesting the veterans were somehow disruptive elements and disrespectful of the local Oak Haven community's peaceful ambiance. Some even dared to hint that the explosion was a false flag operation, cynically designed to discredit legitimate homeowners' rights activists, or that the damage was being grossly exaggerated by a biased media. It was a clearly coordinated, if amateurishly executed disinformation campaign, transparently designed to muddy the waters, to dilute the widespread public outrage, and it bore the unmistakable clumsy hallmarks of a more sophisticated, if ideologically twisted operation, than one disgruntled, entitled woman with a remote detonator and a grudge against bugles. Marcus, monitoring the situation from a hastily established temporary federal command post in a commandeered conference room at the Oak Haven City Hall, felt a growing, deeply troubling unease. This wasn't just about Brenda Hoskins and her prize-winning petunias anymore. Some group was actively trying to control the narrative to protect her, or perhaps more alarmingly, to protect something far larger, something far more dangerous. The preliminary but conclusive report from the FBI and military EOD explosive ordnance disposal technicians confirmed his darkest suspicions and marked the third significant escalation in the case. The explosive device was not, as Brenda Hoskins had flippantly claimed, cobbled together from exceptionally powerful fireworks. It was a professionally constructed, sophisticated improvised explosive device, IED, utilizing a stable but extremely potent military-grade plastic explosive, almost certainly Semtex or C4, carefully shaped to direct the blast. The detonator was equally sophisticated, a commercially available model, but one requiring specific technical knowledge and expertise to integrate correctly and safely into such a device. This wasn't something Brenda Hoskins, the HOA queen, could have picked up at a local hardware store or learned to build from a quick internet tutorial. This was serious. This pointed to specialized training, to privileged access to restricted materials, and most chillingly to a network, a conspiracy. Where in God's name would a woman like Brenda Hoskins, whose biggest prior offense seems to have been illegally trimming a neighbor's prize-winning azaleas, get her manicured hands on military-grade C4, Henderson? Marcus asked, his voice grim, his eyes like chips of ice as they reviewed the initial, heavily redacted EOD findings with SAC Davies in the cramped command post. And who taught her how to use it with such devastating precision? Chief Henderson, looking increasingly overwhelmed and out of his depth, despite his years on the force, shook his head, his face pale and drawn. I have absolutely no idea, Marcus. We're digging into her entire life history, her financials, her known associates, everything. So far, she's just an overzealous, frankly obnoxious HOA committee chair with a bizarre penchant for frivolous complaints and a surprisingly almost inexplicably large personal landscaping budget. That landscaping budget might be a very good place to start digging deeper. Marcus mused aloud, a sudden thought striking him. Explosives like C4 aren't cheap, and they don't just fall off the back of a turnip truck. Someone supplied her, someone funded her, and someone is trying to protect her with this clumsy online smokescreen. He was also thinking about that coordinated online disinformation campaign. It was too slick for a lone wolf, too organized, too reactive. The midpoint of the rapidly escalating investigation arrived with a brutal 1-2 punch of revelations that dramatically, irrevocably altered the trajectory of the entire case, transforming it from a bizarre local bombing into a full-blown national security crisis. The first layer of the devastating twist came from the painstaking forensic analysis of Brenda Hoskins' finances, her encrypted communications, and her meticulously kept, almost obsessively detailed personal records. While she was indeed, as Henderson had noted, pathologically obsessed with the HOA and her beautification projects, there were glaring, inexplicable anomalies, a series of large, unexplained cash withdrawals from obscure out-of-state banks, the presence of highly encrypted military-grade messaging apps on her phone and personal computer apps, far beyond the technical ken of your average HOA committee chair, and bizarrely coded, almost ritualistic references in her emails and private journals to a Willow Creek garden club. A club that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with actual horticulture and everything to do with extremist ideology. More disturbingly, investigators executing a search warrant on her immaculately kept home found hidden beneath a false bottom in her cedar-lined hope chest not just anti-government manifestos and radical propaganda, but highly detailed architectural blueprints of Serenity Park. These weren't casual sketches. They were professional-grade schematics with structural weak points of the main memorial wall and the flagpole highlighted in red ink. This was premeditated, meticulously planned, coldly calculated. The noise complaints. The years of petty grievances were a carefully constructed smokescreen, a pre-prepared and laughably insultingly inadequate public justification for an act of unspeakable ideologically driven violence. Brenda's personal animosity towards the memorial might have been genuine, but it had been co-opted, weaponized by something far larger. Perhaps her husband's own negative experiences as a veteran, his perceived neglect, had made her susceptible to radical rhetoric, blaming the very system that memorialized men like David. If David had been a celebrated hero and her husband a forgotten casualty, the memorial could have become a potent symbol of that injustice in her warped mind. Then came the second, even more chilling and far-reaching layer of the twist. An anonymous tip called into a newly established, highly publicized federal hotline Marcus's office had quietly but effectively promoted in the Oak Haven area, pointed investigators towards a seemingly innocuous, sprawling local business, Oak Haven Secure Storage, a large, anonymous-looking facility located on the dusty, semi-industrial outskirts of town. The tipster, their voice electronically disguised and barely coherent through what sounded like suppressed sobs, mentioned suspicious clandestine late-night activity involving a specific climate-controlled storage unit, Unit 3B, rented under a clearly false, non-traceable name. A name that through painstaking round-the-clock digital forensics and cross-referencing with burner phone triangulation data was eventually tenuously linked back to a burner phone that had been briefly activated in the vicinity of Brenda Hoskins' home on multiple occasions. The tipster also mentioned in a near whisper, "They're planning something bigger, much bigger, at the VA event. You have to stop them." Brenda. She's not the only one. The garden club. It's real. The line had then gone dead. Under a sealed federal warrant obtained at Surat, Burke, Marcus, alongside a visibly shaken Chief Henderson and a heavily armed, highly trained federal tactical team, personally led the pre-dawn raid on Oak Haven's secure storage unit 3B. What they found inside banished any lingering charitable notion that this was the solitary work of a lone, eccentric, dangerously unhinged woman. The large storage unit was a miniature, terrifyingly well-equipped, bomb-making factory and extremist cell headquarters. More C4 rolls of detonation cord, an assortment of sophisticated electronic detonators, and timers advanced surveillance equipment, and a disturbing collection of radical anti-government and white supremacist propaganda from various known domestic extremist groups. Chillingly, there were also detailed maps and recent surveillance photos of other potential targets, the Oak Haven VA hospital site of the upcoming dedication ceremony, a federal courthouse in a nearby city, and even a meticulously annotated route map for a planned gubernatorial motorcade scheduled for the following month. Brenda Hoskins was not just an HOA Karen with an explosive grudge and a warped sense of civic duty. She was a key operative, a deeply embedded node in a larger, far more dangerous and ideologically driven domestic terrorist network. Her public persona, the obsessive, petty, rule-enforcing tyrant of Oak Haven Estates, was a meticulously crafted, brilliantly effective cover. She was a domestic extremist, a soldier in a hidden war, and the brutal attack on the Serenity Park Veterans Memorial was not an isolated act of pique or madness. It was a calculated statement, possibly a gruesome test run, or perhaps a deliberately provocative act designed to lure federal authorities into a trap or to sow widespread chaos and fear. The Willow Creek Garden Club, mentioned in her emails and by the anonymous tipster, was now horrifyingly clear her operational cell, its innocuous name, a sick, cynical joke. The coordinated online disinformation campaign now made perfect, terrifying sense. They weren't just trying to protect Brenda Hoskins, their foot soldier. They were desperately trying to protect their entire covert operation, their deadly arsenal, and their future, far more ambitious plans. The entire multi-agency investigation kicked into hyperdrive. Marcus, now operating fully and overtly in his capacity as Chief of Federal Public Safety, personally directed and coordinated a sprawling, rapidly expanding task force. The primary focus shifted dramatically from the singular act of bombing the memorial to identifying, locating, and neutralizing every single member of the Oak Haven Garden Club extremist cell before they could strike again. Brenda Hoskins, confronted in her sterile interrogation room with the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence from the storage unit, photographs, inventory lists, surveillance footage of her accessing the unit, remained stubbornly, almost supernaturally silent, her eyes burning with a cold, fanatic light. Her high-powered civil lawyer, Wallace Thorne, now looked clearly out of his depth, visibly alarmed, and was frantically trying to negotiate a plea deal that was simply not on the table. The climax of the operation, the final confrontation, approached with terrifying, inexorable speed. Through painstaking round-the-clock analysis of encrypted communications, complex financial trails, and fragmented data recovered from damaged electronic devices found in the storage unit and from Brenda's home, the task force identified two other key members of the Oak Haven Garden Club cell, a disgruntled, highly skilled ex-military demolitions expert named Frank Rourke, who likely had access to the military-grade explosives and the technical expertise to construct the IEDs, and a quiet, seemingly unassuming IT technician named Sarah Jenkins, who worked for a local county contractor, and it was discovered, the technical brains behind the cell's encrypted communications, their online disinformation campaigns, and their sophisticated counter-surveillance measures. She was also, they suspected, the anonymous tipster, perhaps having developed a crisis of conscience or a fear of capture. They also uncovered with a chilling certainty that turned Marcus's blood to ice the cell's next planned attack, a far more devastating, multi-pronged series of coordinated bombings targeting the upcoming dedication ceremony at the Oak Haven VA hospital. The very event Marcus was scheduled to attend and speak at, the event that would gather hundreds of veterans, their families, and local dignitaries in one vulnerable open-air location. They planned to use the ensuing chaos and mass casualties to make a horrific public statement broadcasting their twisted anti-government, anti-military manifesto to a horrified nation. The bombing of the memorial had been in part a brutal test of their capabilities and a way to gauge law enforcement response times. The day of the VA hospital dedication ceremony arrived cloaked in an atmosphere of almost unbearable unspoken tension. The public milling about the hospital grounds was largely unaware of the imminent lethal threat, though security around the sprawling VA hospital campus was visibly, though discreetly heightened, far beyond what would be considered normal for such an event. Marcus stood a coiled spring of controlled energy in the mobile command center, a converted heavily armored RV, bristling with advanced communications gear, parked unobtrusively a quarter-mile from the hospital's main entrance. He watched the multiple high-definition feeds from dozens of hidden cameras, listened intently to the terse-coated chatter of hundreds of plainclothes, federal agents and tactical officers deployed strategically throughout the area. Rourke and Jenkins were still at large, their precise locations unknown, though intelligence suggested they would attempt to infiltrate the event. Brenda Hoskins remained in federal custody, uncooperative and defiant. The agonizing plan was to allow the ceremony to begin to create an illusion of normalcy, to draw Rourke and Jenkins out, luring them into a carefully prepared net, making them believe their horrific plot was still undetected. The cell's recovered, partially decrypted communications had indicated they planned to be on site, to personally witness, and perhaps even film their masterpiece. As the first innocuous speeches began at the outdoor dedication stage under a deceptively bright and cheerful late-morning sun, a specialized surveillance team positively identified Frank Rourke, attempting to blend in with the crowd of attendees, his movements slightly too deliberate, his eyes scanning not the stage, but the surrounding buildings and escape routes. He carried a heavy nondescript backpack. Simultaneously, another highly trained team spotted Sarah Jenkins in a nearby coffee shop overlooking the hospital grounds. Her laptop opened, her fingers flying across the keyboard, likely preparing to launch a synchronized cyber attack on local emergency communication systems, or to disseminate their pre-recorded propaganda message the moment the first bomb detonated. Teams Alpha and Beta engage. Engage now. Priority 1 Rourke. Priority 2 Jenkins. Go, go, go. Marcus ordered into his headset, his voice preternaturally calm but resonant with an authority that left no room for hesitation. The takedown was swift, brutally efficient, professional, and to the vast majority of the unsuspecting public, enjoying the ceremony, almost invisible. Rourke, a large and powerfully built man, was surrounded and subdued by a phalanx of disguised tactical officers before he could reach into his backpack, which was later found to contain a powerful, remotely triggerable IED, identical to the one used at the memorial, along with 2 loaded handguns. He put up a brief violent struggle, injuring one agent with a vicious headbutt before being overwhelmed. Jenkins, her face a mask of shocked disbelief as federal agents swarmed the coffee shop, was apprehended as she desperately tried to slam her laptop shut and activate a data wipe program. A small .25 caliber pistol was found in her purse. "You were never going to win," she hissed at the arresting agent, her voice dripping with venom. "This is just the beginning." Back in the echoing silence of the mobile command center, Marcus Thorne, Chief of Federal Public Safety, allowed himself a single, deep, shuddering breath. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, the image of David's smiling face, then the smoking ruin of his memorial flashing behind his eyelids. The immediate catastrophic threat had been neutralized, but the long, hard fight against this insidious, deeply rooted poison was far from over. The falling action saw the complete systematic unraveling of the Oak Haven Garden Club domestic extremist cell and its broader, though loosely affiliated network. Frank Rourke and Sarah Jenkins, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the terrifying prospect of spending the rest of their natural lives in a federal supermax facility, began, albeit reluctantly and strategically, to cooperate with investigators. They revealed the full extent of their cell's network, their disturbing radicalization process. Much of it online, fueled by conspiracy theories and extremist forums and their chillingly ambitious plans for future attacks across several states. Brenda Hoskins, her meticulously constructed facade of the aggrieved, rule-obsessed suburbanite, finally shattered beyond repair, eventually broke down during a tense interrogation with Marcus and SAC Davies. However, she never expressed a single shred of remorse, only a cold, simmering fury at being caught, at her mission being thwarted. It became sickeningly clear that her years of noise complaints and HOA activism had been in part a deliberate long-term grooming of a public narrative, a way to normalize her animosity towards the memorial, and all it represented, making her eventual violent act seem in her twisted, narcissistic mind less shocking, perhaps even understandable to a sympathetic few. Her perceived personal slights regarding her own family's military service had been expertly twisted and exploited by Rourke, who had identified her as a prime candidate for radicalization. The nation reacted with widespread horror and profound disbelief to the revelation that such a dangerous, ideologically driven terrorist cell had been operating undetected for so long under the deceptively placid, benign guise of suburban normalcy in a town like Oakhaven. The swift arrests and the dramatic last-minute prevention of the VA hospital bombing were widely lauded by the media and public officials, but the Oakhaven incident sent a chilling, unambiguous message about the evolving, insidious nature of domestic extremism and its ability to take root in the most unexpected of places. Brenda Hoskins, Frank Rourke, and Sarah Jenkins were indicted on a slew of multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, bombing a place of public use, attempted murder of federal officers stemming from Rourke's resistance, and providing material support to a designated terrorist organization. Their assets, including Brenda's meticulously landscaped Oakhaven home, which it was proven had been used to host cell meetings and store components, were seized under federal forfeiture laws, as they were proven to be instrumentalities used to facilitate their criminal enterprise. The resolution of the Oakhaven bombing was multifaceted, resonating through the legal system, the community, and national policy. In the courts, justice, though slow, was ultimately served. The trial was a grim media sensation, laying bare for a shocked public the chilling, meticulous details of the cell's deadly plans and Brenda's duplicitous, manipulative nature. All three principal defendants received lengthy, uncompromising prison sentences, effectively dismantling their capacity to cause further harm and sending a strong deterrent message. Nationally, the Oakhaven bombing became an unexpected, tragic catalyst for significant change. Congress, spurred by intense public outcry and relentless, powerful lobbying from veterans groups, victims advocacy organizations, and public safety agencies, with Marcus Thorne providing quiet but influential expert testimony, passed the Serenity Park Veterans Protection Act. This piece of landmark federal legislation significantly increased penalties for attacks on memorials, monuments, and places of remembrance, and provided substantial federal funding for enhanced security measures and threat assessment programs at such sites nationwide. Locally, the Oakhaven community was shaken to its very core, its cherished illusion of peaceful, insulated tranquility shattered. The revelation that Brenda Hoskins, a familiar, if often profoundly irritating local presence, was in fact a dangerous, deeply committed extremist, forced a painful collective reckoning. The Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association was thrown into complete turmoil, its petty squabbles over lawn heights and mailbox colors suddenly seeming laughably, obscenely trivial in the face of the true evil that had festered in their midst. There were public apologies, tearful town hall meetings, and a renewed, if fragile, commitment to fostering genuine community spirit, open dialogue, and mutual respect, rather than just enforcing arbitrary, divisive rules. Dr. Alistair Finch, the history professor, was unanimously elected as the new interim HOA president, tasked with healing the rifts. Serenity Park Veterans Memorial was slowly, lovingly, painstakingly rebuilt. Volunteers from across the state, veterans and civilians alike, young and old, came in droves to help to contribute to reclaim the sacred space. Clara Thorne was there every day, a quiet, determined presence, often working alongside Marcus when he could slip away from his duties in Washington. The rededication ceremony, held exactly 1 year after the bombing, was a profoundly moving, deeply emotional event, attended by thousands. Marcus Thorne was there, not as the chief of federal public safety this time, but as a citizen, a brother, a grateful American, standing arm in arm with his sister Clara as a lone bugler, played a flawless, heartbreaking rendition of Taps. The new dedication wall was stronger, the names of the fallen etched even deeper into a more resilient type of granite. The flagpole stood tall and proud, the stars and stripes waving gallantly against a clear, hopeful blue sky. The scars remained, of course, both on the resilient landscape and in the collective memory of Oakhaven. But from the ashes of violence, hatred, and inexplicable malice, something strong, Something unexpectedly resilient had undeniably emerged. A community had been brutally tested, and in the crucible of that test had found a deeper, more authentic strength, a truer sense of shared humanity. A nation had been starkly, painfully reminded of the preciousness of its symbols of sacrifice and the ongoing, unending need for vigilance against those both foreign and domestic who would seek to destroy them. Months later, Clara established the David Miller Resiliency Fund, a local charity dedicated to providing support services for veterans struggling with PTSD and for the families of fallen first responders. It was her way, she said, of ensuring that David's legacy and the lessons of Serenity Park would be one of healing and hope, not hatred and division. The shrill, discordant voice of false grievance and violent extremism had been silenced, at least in Oakhaven, replaced by a renewed, resonant chorus of remembrance, respect, and an unwavering collective commitment to the enduring ideals for which the memorial stood. The long, somber shadows of that terrible, sun-drenched afternoon had finally truly begun to recede, giving way slowly but surely to the enduring hopeful light of courage, unity, and an unyielding human spirit.